need to yeah, so the ones that we need to remember and that everyone reminds us of is the flu epidemic, which occurred in 1918 to 1920, and there were a lot of deaths, about 50 to 100 million deaths. Then there were other ones also, but the one that I was personally associated with was the AIDS epidemic over here, which resulted in about 36 million deaths. And if you see the years, you will see that these pandemics and epidemics actually last for a long time. It would be nice if they would just come in for a few months and then go away just to remind us, but it doesn't happen that way. It lasts a long time, and that is something if you read history, then you will understand this. And that was my idea. The AIDS epidemic is a little personal to me because I was doing my PhD at that time, and there was a lab technician by the name Peter who was with us, and who unfortunately passed away during this phase. So the other one that hello, are you able to hear? Are you able to hear? Yeah. Please mute your mic so that others are not affected. Okay, so the other one that I was actively following was the Ebola one, and Ebola was something that I would bring up as a possible disease in my classes, as something that could happen. And unfortunately, what happened is it did happen. So again, you will see it lasted for a few years, and it was primarily in West Africa, but it was contained. So that was the most important thing. And this was I put this under a category of a possible disease that turned into reality. And then, of course, now we are familiar with the COVID-19 one. So the flu one that we talked about, which resulted in 50 to 100 million deaths, it's primarily known as the Spanish flu, but the name is actually a misnomer. Because the only reason was that, if you remember, 1914 to 1918 was World War I. And so this started off at the end of World War I. And Spain was neutral at that time, and so Spain did most of the reporting. So unfortunately, that's how the news came, mainly from Spain, right? And that's why it was known as a Spanish flu, but it's a misnomer because it spread. And you will see that even in our country, it was affected. So, we had about 17 to 18 million deaths, almost 6% of our population passed away. And the first wave occurred in June 2018, and these were from soldiers who were returning from World War I, right? And the second wave came up with variants in September 2018, and more mortality was actually seen in the second wave, right? And again, why were the deaths so high? One, of course, it was new. There was no idea about lack of quarantine, right? So this was an important aspect. So, people spread, so the soldiers went from one place to another and, took the disease along with them. There were a lot of secondary bacterial infections, right? And a lot of people died because of sepsis and so on. The other important part was the most of the young were affected. So why were the elderly or the old affected? The idea was that the elderly had already seen some bouts of flu, so they were better protected. So they were naturally protected, whereas the young ones were unprotected, and therefore the young were more affected. So something, again, an important aspect to be kept in mind, keeping in context the current pandemic. Okay. So let's come directly to the coronavirus. Most of you are sort of familiar with it. You must also be familiar that its family members are the SARS and the MERS ones, and it's known corona because of the crown-like appearance of it. And the crown-like appearance comes from the spike protein. Right. Okay, and the discovery of the coronavirus came from different groups. So you had the David Tyrrell's group in England that passaged this virus, was able to grow it, right? And these in organ cultures, right? And so this was in 1966. You had another group, that is the Dorothy Hamrace group at University of Chicago, and in fact, she isolated it from students who had cold, right? So both these viruses were sensitive to, they were covered with a lipid coat, so they're very sensitive to detergents and so on. And these were grown in organ culture, and therefore they were known as, organ viruses. Seeing is believing, and this is June Almeida. This is with her TEM microscope. She was the first one to reveal actually what the coronavirus looks like. And these are the TEM images, as you can see. And subsequently, the other viruses in the same family also had the same morphology. So, and that's why corona came up. And this is a nice picture because you can see the number of viral particles replicating in a single animal cell, huge numbers, right? So this is something, again, important for us to remember. And you can see this is of a single one with the spike protein, right? And you have different types of coronaviruses. You have the alpha corona and the beta corona. And the ones that we need to be concerned with are mainly the beta coronas, because the MERS, SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV, they belong to the beta coronavirus. You have other ones also, the 229E, which most people, a lot of groups studied. And these also cause common cold, right? And so these come under the category of common cold viruses. You have the gamma and the delta ones, a coronavirus family, but they don't attack mammals, so it's something that's useful to remember. Okay, so I will now, most of you are sort of familiar with the original SARS infection that started off in 2002, and it resulted in some cases and some deaths, again, but the fatality was high. In MERS, which started off in the Middle East, in fact, the fatality rate was very high, 35%, but it didn't spread. So you need two things. If you are a virus, you want to be highly transmissible. If you are highly pathogenic, then it's not good for us. So these were warning signs over here, because you had the SARS one, and in the MERS one was in 2012. So these were probably warning shots, but we were not able to, catch them. And so this was the 2020 article that was published by the bat lady known as Zhengxi Li, who works in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they categorized, this spread of this virus that probably caused a pneumonia-like infection, which
so many questions will come and you will be knowing. The whole 19 subjects in 3 hours.
Dr. Kavita, mute Madi, please.
Yeah, can you please mute? Can the others please mute? Otherwise, it's okay. One of the good things about this infection, in fact, that the vast majority of infections are actually mild to moderate, so about 80%. It's severe only in some, but critical in a few. But over here, numbers play a very important role. So if 100 people get infected, about 5%, about 5 people will be in the critical part. Now, as the numbers increase, right, from 100, if it goes to 10,000, from 10,000 to a lakh, from a lakh to a million, you can see that 5% numbers increase. And then that is when we have problems with hospitalizations and so on, a lack of oxygen and so on. So numbers are very important. Even though it's 5%, as the numbers increase, this becomes a problem. And this is exactly what happened in the second wave in India, right? Which was earlier this year. And I'm sure most of you are aware of this. A lot of these viruses spread through bats, but in fact, with the original SARS, civets were thought to be responsible to make this transition before it came into humans. In case of MERS, it was camels, that humans got it from camels and so on. So these are important parts. Even with the current one, this becomes important because I'm sure you would have heard about tigers in zoos, becoming positive and so on. And in some parts of the world, you have these minks, right? Now, these minks had got infected and millions of mink were slaughtered, right? And they were slaughtered because if they get infected, then the odds are that some variants and all may come up. So it might be a breeding ground for variants because more the numbers. So so unfortunately, a lot of these animals were eliminated. So the SARS-CoV-2 enters primarily via a receptor-mediated pathway, which is the ACE2 mediated pathway. It can also enter through the endosomal pathway. The endosomal pathway is very slow, right? So that's something that we need to understand, and it's possible that because it goes mainly through the receptor-mediated pathway, that a lot of interventions have also been designed over here. So what happens is primarily the spike protein binds to ACE2, but it needs to be cleaved. It needs to be cleaved by a serine protease or cathepsin L present on the surface, and then the virus can enter and it injects its genetic material over here. And this is actually an excellent article, and I urge all the students to take a look at this article, which was published again earlier this year. This is a wonderful article, very nice figures to try and explain how the virus replicates. Once it gets in, then you have, it will encode its proteins to be made. But another important part comes in. Now, before the final packaging is done, it needs to be cleaved by another protease known as the furin protease. And the furin protease becomes important because in case the furin protease cleavage sites and all are not there, the virus does not replicate well. So again, very important over here. So this brings me to the aspects of variants. You have lots of them, and we can expect more variants again in the future. It's something that we cannot avoid. Now, one of the good points is that the coronaviruses don't mutate as much as, let's say, the flu, right? It's about a 5-fold less. So, in fact, every year the vaccine makers make newer flu ones to try and make sure that they're making the vaccine against the right one. So that's something to remember. So now you have two main types. First is you have variants of infection. So these are the ones that are being monitored, right? And the ones that actually breach and cause larger amounts of outbreaks are the variants of concern, right? So these are the important ones, right? So you have the original Wuhan strain, but then that got changed. And you have the Alpha one, for example, which originated primarily in the UK. You have the Beta one, which originated in the South Africa. And you can see some of them have more transmissibility and are more lethal. Again, as the numbers increase, as I said, the numbers, obviously more people will tend to be affected. So please be a little bit, wary about these aspects. You have the Gamma, which again, which was again much more, and then the Delta one, of course, and right now, majority of the cases are really Delta because Delta has taken over because of the high mutation frequency. So, it's something that we need to guard all the time. And what about the current one? The current one that the Omicron, the one that we are all, that a lot of people are concerned of. And the concern, what is the concern with? The concern is that you have, it has a lot of mutations in the spike protein. And remember, a lot of the vaccines are made, with the spike protein, right? So if there are a lot of mutations, perhaps the antibody responses might be affected. So that is again, something that one is worried about, right? And so we need to see what happens in the future. But because the virus has already caused, such a lot of panic, everybody's, a little bit worried about it, and then see. But the fact of the matter is that the virus is going to mutate again in the future. We will have more mutants, right? And we need to be on our guard, a lot of time, because even though there is community transmission, you will have to be on your guard all the time, right? Okay, so how do diseases spread? So one of the important parts, there are two main people over here. One is John Snow. John Snow was the one who found out how it spread, how cholera spread, right? And he identified a well which was responsible for the spread of cholera in London at that time. So very nice work, regarding the spread or transmission of diseases. This person is again not so well known, Ignaz Semmelweis, who in fact, at that time, and the times that he lived, women, if they became pregnant and were about to give, birth to babies, the odds were very high that they may lose their lives because there might be infections during the birth of babies. And he was the one who identified this and who said that a simple thing, a solution of highly antiseptic measures was very useful. And especially he said all the people there have to, which is the doctors and the nurses, have to be very careful about washing their hands and about a high level of hygiene. And in fact, he is considered a savior for mothers. Let me also say that at that time when he lived, a lot of people did not believe him. And in fact, unfortunately, he was consigned to a mental asylum because a lot of his colleagues did not believe what he said. But, he's now considered to be a savior. And it's something that all of us need to keep in mind. Okay, regarding the spread of corona, so from exposure to symptoms, it takes about 10 to 15 days, but the mean is actually about 4 to 5 days. Okay, so that's again something to keep in mind. With respect to India, the first report in India was 30th January 2020, where the first case was reported. But by the time it came in IISc, it was in June 2020 when we had the first case inside IISc. Okay, so then this part, especially this part, is the contagious phase, and then the first 6 days, once you start, you become symptomatic, which is you start showing symptoms, right? Often you have fever, chills, loss of smell, diarrhea, and some people also get into happy hypoxia, which is why blood oxygen needs to be measured, and that's why you have the oximeter, the pulse oximeters, which turn out to be very useful. And apart from the next 6 days turn out to be very important because these determine whether you are undergoing a high inflammation or not, right? So this becomes very important because in case your inflammatory cytokines are very high and so on, it might be better for you to get admitted and so on. So 6 to 18 days post, the second stage is critical, and especially for progression of disease and so on. So let me now come on to a little bit of a story. In fact, this is a very famous story. This is about the Diamond Princess, right? What happened over here is, an elderly person boarded this particular ship in Yokohama, Japan, right? 20th January 2020, all right? And so the ship was, in the sea, and you didn't have any other people around it. So it was something that you could monitor. On 23rd January, this person presents coughing symptoms and is disembarked within 3 days in Hong Kong, to a hospital. But 1st February, the patient tests positive for COVID-19 and all the passengers are quarantined in their rooms, right? So they can't move out, they can't mix and all, right? And then 8 to 18th February, there is increase in cases seen. By March, more than 700 passengers tested positive in that ship. So the question is, one infected person caused spread of this disease. And the spread of the disease when the passengers were quarantined primarily in their rooms. So how did it spread? This was the big question. So they were quarantined, all proper precautions were taken, but still the disease spread. So this is important, right? And all this business about droplets and all could happen only if you were in close proximity. Now over here, the passengers were, in their rooms. So how did it spread so much? So this was the big question over here, and this is why we need to understand the difference between droplets and aerosols, right? So droplets are larger particles which fall down and which, that's why this is where physical distancing plays an important role. Aerosols are much smaller, and so the virus can be in terms of droplets, but can also fly around in terms of aerosols, and aerosols hang out in the air for much longer. And so therefore you might have heard, people have not stepped out of their houses, especially the elderly. They've got scared, they've not stepped out of their houses, and they've got infected, right? So how was that possible? It's possible because of aerosols. If they've opened their doors, some aerosols might have come in through the staircases. Staircases and lifts are primarily, areas where a lot of spread occurs, right? Especially in apartment staircases, because they are often closed, they are not so well ventilated. So it's a very important aspect, right? So something very important for all of you to remember, the difference between aerosols and droplets. Please make sure about it, okay? Now, originally WHO thought, it spreads mainly through droplets, and that's why, all this cleaning and business, all the, physical distancing and so on. But now it spreads, we know now it spreads primarily through aerosols. So it's something that you need to keep in mind. So luckily, late in the day, 30th April 2021, WHO made the change, and that aerosols were also responsible for the spread of SARS-CoV-2, right? But this was late, and a lot of people did not realize, and a lot of people had already died. So therefore, it's best to avoid crowded places and close contact with people. So just make sure about that. And if you have meetings in well-ventilated areas, that's with the fan on, that is something that you want to do, because what you're doing is you're diluting the load, right? So good open air, good ventilation is something that's really important, and that is likely to reduce the spread of disease, something very important. I urge you all to read this wonderful article by Lindsay Marr, right? Over here, which was in the Wired on aerosol transmission. In fact, Lindsay Marr was the person who pushed forward and tried to convince WHO that, look, it's likely that, you have to consider that aerosols might also be responsible, right? So something very important out over here. So therefore, you need to protect yourself, and that's why masks have become important, and multi-layered masks become very important, and make sure that you wash them regularly, right? Don't have to wear the same mask every day, right? And so masks, greatly reduce dissemination, and so it's something that you must keep in mind. All right. So now let's come on to a question known as R naught. R naught refers to the average number of cases from one infected person. And you can see some diseases are very contagious, like pertussis, measles. They are highly contagious. One person can infect, about 12 to 18 people, right? So these come under the highly contagious group. Polio is also, contagious, 4 to 6. Tuberculosis is highly variable. 0.4 in Netherlands, 4.3 in China, right? Now, remember in India, we almost have about, 4.4 lakh deaths due to TB every year. So, our deaths due to tuberculosis is very high. Influenza, the R naught is about 2.3, SARS-CoV-2 is around 2.5, but this 2.5, don't be fooled by that. It's an average. So, if you have these variants, some of these may have a much more higher transmissibility. And if you club it all together, you might come into 2.5, but you must know the range over here. So that becomes important out over here. Okay. So close contact becomes important because airborne transmission becomes important. Out over here, it infects the upper respiratory tract, causes damage to lungs and so on. And then in some people, there are high inflammatory responses which can cause sepsis, multi-organ failure, and so on, right? Now, obviously, COVID-19 has caused a lot of damage. You have about, as of 5th December, you have, 266 million cases, about 5.2 million deaths worldwide, right? So, this is a huge amount, right? In India, we have also had a large number of cases, and deaths have been, we have about, at least the official deaths are about 4.74 lakhs so far, right? Some perspective is important over here. So this is over almost 2 years now. And we have, due to road accidents per year, we have 1.5 lakh deaths. And as I mentioned, due to tuberculosis, we have about, 4.4 lakh deaths per year. Diagnosis, I think this has been covered, so I'll just quickly go around it. RT-PCR is the gold standard over here. You have other ones also over here, but most people usually do RT-PCR. You have the RTs also, but the RTs are less sensitive, so that's something that you might want to keep in mind. A good idea it would be also to get your blood parameters studied once you know that you're infected, just to know your inflammatory cytokine profile. And there are different ones over here, the C-reactive proteins, the CRPs, the IL-6, ferritins and the D dimers. D dimers actually tell you about your the blood clots that are being formed. And more the blood clots, more the chances that you might be heading towards, sepsis. So that's again, of concern over here. So therefore, following not only being positive, but also following your blood parameters becomes important over here. Right. One of the important things that the Indian government did was to find out the number of people that were positive, right, over a period of time. And these sero surveys are done by the ICMR, the Indian Council of Medical Research. And the first one was done in May, June 2020, and very less number of people were positive, 0.7%. By the time they did the fourth one, the average is about 67.6%. Now, I'm always afraid of averages, because when you average, you put all data together and you multiply it, right? And what we know about the monsoons in India is that they'll tell you the monsoons are good, right? Good does not reveal a lot, because what it says is overall it might be good. But let's say Karnataka might receive very scanty rainfall, whereas some other state can receive very high rainfalls and the average would be good, right? So it's something, so one must be a little bit more careful to try and find out details, because the devil is in the details. Averages, just sum up everything. So even with your data, be careful of averages. You must know the variations and see where it's high, where it's low, and how do you generate the average, right? So let's take a closer look at the average one. So if you look, some states have very high spread of disease, right? So Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, UP, Karnataka, you have fairly high spread of disease over here, and this ranges around 68 to 71%. Remember, at this time, vaccines were not that much in vogue. So this is infections that have resulted, and the positivity is because of infections primarily. Maharashtra, West Bengal is about 58 to 60%. Kerala, you had less spread of disease. So that means they did a good job of quarantining themselves. But perhaps because of quarantining themselves, too much, they had less spread of disease, and that's why right now, in fact, Kerala and both Maharashtra are among the higher ones, right? Okay, but what this also means is 33, if this is true, then it also means that 33% of our population are unprotected. So therefore, we need to be more careful. And therefore, understanding the granularity of the data becomes very important, right? So right now, about 35% of our people have received, both the jabs. That's, again, something that we need to keep in mind. With regard to treatment of TB, treatment of COVID-19, you have, two main trials that were conducted. One is the Solidarity, which was led by the WHO. The other is the Recovery, done by the UK under the National Health Scheme that they have, which is their medical care, right? And so these are proper trials that were done to assess the benefits of different medications, which is important, right? Instead of just saying something is good or going by empirical evidence, it's better that proper clinical trials are done. So once this was done, remdesivir, which was used to treat other viruses, was also found to be somewhat effective. Favipiravir, which is used as anti-flu medication in Japan, was also found to be effective. So low-dose dexamethasone or steroids are important, but one has to be very careful about it, because timing plays a very important role. So if you give it very early on, you're going to prevent the host response. If you give it somewhat later, it might be useful, because then you're trying to prevent the inflammatory response or the excess inflammatory response. So therefore, dose and timing becomes very important over here, right? And, so one has to be very careful about this and not just randomly start taking steroids, okay? Be very careful about this. Anticoagulants are important because, as I said, as your D-dimer levels increases, it shows that you're heading more towards a sepsis-like situation. Again, this becomes important. So, low-weight heparin, blood thinners like aspirin might again be useful over here. Now, there are also monoclonal antibodies against SARS-CoV-2, some of which are very useful. If you remember, President Trump was injected with the monoclonal, and he said he took it and he immediately felt good. right? So these are also now Roche Cipla, have it. So these are also available in India. So that's again something one needs to keep in mind. Now there are oral pills that FDA has approved. So Merck has one, this Molnupiravir, which blocks viral replication. There is another one by Roche, which also is at the viral replication stage. Pfizer has one, which is a protease inhibitor. So again, these are something that we need to keep track of, right? Okay, there are inflammatory responses against SARS-CoV-2, and this shows that you have large monocytes over here. If you see the healthy, you don't have these ones, but you have large monocytes that show up with SARS-CoV-2. So you have much more of an inflammatory response against this. So both B cell as well as T cell responses are seen against this. And it's very interesting that that some of the T cell responses against common cold coronaviruses can protect also, or can fight against SARS-CoV-2. So that again is something very important, right? And so this came up pretty early on, because you had people who had never been exposed to SARS-CoV-2, and their blood cells were able to show reactivity, and that's because of the cross-reactivity against the common cold coronaviruses, especially with regard to T cells. So that's something that one needs to keep in mind over here. Now, why is it that kids don't seem to have more infections, right? Whereas adults have it. Now, remember, the ACE2 receptor is also less in kids, so that's again something that is important. And kids seem to have more neutrophils, more type 2 cytotoxic T cells. They also have a little somewhat of a different kind of cells in the respiratory tract, which might be an important thing. But this clearly points out that more studies are required to find out differences between kids and adults, and differences between immune responses in these cases. Now, one of the other things that comes up, unfortunately, is that you have people who have COVID who suffer from COVID much later down the line also, right? Or the manifestations of COVID, and that comes under the category of long COVID, right? So even after they are RT-PCR negative, months after that, right, they show manifestations which show up as tiredness, migraines, feeling of exhaustion, and so on, muscle weakness, and so on, right? So this is a major problem over here. And again, especially for people, they're trying to find out the reasons for it. Why is it that only some people have this? Now, it's also possible, again, the numbers play an important role, because this is often seen in case of some viral infections, right? But again, because the numbers are so high with COVID, right, that even if a small percentage suffers from these, it shows up. And this is something, again, that we need to keep in mind. And in what is seen is, inflammatory cytokines tend to be high in these people, right? 6 months, and later post the infection. And so naturally they have these effects. So they have to be a little bit careful over here. And so, further studies are required to be done for this, and also trying to find drugs that will help you, deal with long COVID. That's again something that's in the pipeline that we're studying. But by and large, vaccines are the general source over here. So why are vaccines important over here? Because you need to protect your population. In terms of public health policy, vaccines are the biggest, give you the biggest benefit. So they are the most cost-effective public policy tool, and that's something we need to keep in mind. Remember, polio, smallpox. There are smallpox has been completely eradicated. Polio has been eradicated in most parts, except for some countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria, where you have very less coverage. But there are other problems associated with it. It's not that the technology is not there. It is that there are some cultural issues over here that are preventing everyone from getting vaccinated over here. But this is what shows you the efficacy of vaccines, for example. This is once vaccines were introduced in 1982. You can see the new hepatitis B infections dropping down drastically over here. One person whom we need to thank and recall is actually Morris Hildeman, who's been responsible, who's the inventor of more than 40 vaccines, and most people are completely unaware of this. So he worked in a company in Merck, for example, and made several types of vaccines, right? And in fact, it's a well-known story that one day his daughter got infected by the mumps virus, and he went back to the lab. He collected some instruments, came back, got took a swab from the daughter, and went back and started measuring the virus. And in fact, it is said that the daughter recovered from the infection, but not the virus, because the virus was made attenuated, and he made a vaccine out of it. Okay, so and not only one, he's made several. He was also, somewhat of a prickly character, and he often said, "I ran into conflict with just about everyone," because not only was he was careful about the vaccines that he made, but he also wanted to oversee the production aspects of the vaccine and so on, right? But he was also a strong component of 7-day work week for scientists, right? And he said, in fact, my hobby is working. Again, it's something very important for faculty as well as for students to sort of keep this in mind. Let me tell you a little bit about vaccinations in India. And this is again, a wonderful article by Chandrakant Laharia in the Indian Journal of Medical Research in 2014. I urge you all to read this, right? Wonderful article. We often don't read, articles published in India, but this was really a wonderful one, right? So he talks about, vaccines, about right from Jenner's and so on. But let's talk a little bit about some of the vaccines, right? BCG, for example, right? BCG. Now there have been problems with vaccines, right? So BCG was developed by Calmette Guerin, after culturing Mycobacterium bovis for several years on a particular media, right? And BCG has had good efficacy. It's been several years we have been using BCG, and but there have been some problems also. In 1930, for example, it got contaminated with a virulent strain, and which was stored in the same incubator, and a lot of people died. So currently, BCG is a widely used vaccine. So again, it's used as a booster. So you need to think in terms of booster over here. So BCG is part of the National TB Control Program. Now here's one aspect. BCG has been found to be very effective against pediatric TB, and that is why it is given to kids. BCG efficacy in India, you had the Chingalpet trials and all, you were not able to see efficacy between the control group when you did proper clinical trials. And that is understandable. It's understandable because in India, there is tuberculosis all around. If you have traveled the trains, if you have traveled the buses over here, you are getting exposed to tuberculosis. So, it's impossible to avoid it. So therefore, we are naturally, infected, right? But all of us don't come down with it, right? It's only if you're deprived, if you're nutrition deprived, if you're immune deprived, often that these come up. And BCG is part of the universal vaccination program. In fact, we do have a universal vaccination program where you see the type of vaccines that need to be given to different types of people, right? And these are very important. These are boosters and so on, and that need to be given. So by and large, about 80% of kids are covered by the universal immunization program, and I think that's good. Not fully, we can certainly do better, but a large number are already covered over here, and we need to do better. Okay. Now, in terms of vaccines, one person in India stands out, and that's Haffkine, and it's Haffkine who first made the original vaccine in India, right? And so, but the first vaccine that he made was against cholera, and he wanted to try it out. So he made it when he was in Pasteur Institute. He tried it out on himself. So of course, human ethics, there were no question of getting clearances from human ethics over here, right? But then he wanted to try it out on larger groups of people, right? So then he came to India and he stayed on, right? And so he got lucky. In fact, in Kolkata, there was a group over here, and people were coming down. So he had, a control group, and which was not given the vaccine. You had a vaccine group, and people from the vaccine group got very less. So in fact, that was the first success that he got. But there was another, soon after that, there was another disaster that was brewing, because you had the plague, right? And Yersinia pestis was spreading, and they came in through the ships and so on, and plague got in. So bubonic plague affected us, and you can see different states, over here that were affected, and case fatality was very high. So naturally, the government was concerned about it. So they asked Haffkine to make the vaccine, right? So vaccine, he started working in Bombay, and in fact in the Grant Medical College, and developed the vaccine. Again, who does he test it on? He tested it on himself originally, right? Again, he developed fever and so on, but he survived, right? So, so that vaccine was given, and hundreds were vaccinated, and obviously saved a lot of lives. In December 1910, he was knighted by the Queen, because he has made such a big discovery that have helped people and so on. And then disaster struck. So Haffkine was the first person to make the vaccine, but unfortunately, it also led to the first case of adverse events following vaccination. What happened is, in March 1902, some people were vaccinated in Punjab, and they died after taking the vaccine. So obviously there was some problem, and there was one vial that was contamination. It was a low level of contamination, but it took time for it. Okay, so 1903, Haffkine was fired as a director and placed on leave, right? And so then there was a big thing, on how to deal with it, right? But meanwhile, the plague reached a peak in India, and Haffkine's vaccine was the main line of defense, right? And so there were discussions in the UK Parliament, and he was exonerated in 1907 by the British Parliament. But he was retired as head of Calcutta Biology Labs, but he was banned from performing any clinical or experiments, and only theoretical research was permitted. In 1914, Haffkine retired from the ICS and left India. In 1930, he died in France. So what we have is the Plague Research Laboratory, where he made the vaccine and all, is now the Haffkine Institute. And this was the official mansion of the governor of Bombay at that time, right? And it is now a teaching institute in the field of biomedical sciences, right? In 1925, the government lobbied to rename the Plague Research Laboratory after Haffkine. And this is what he wrote to the director. The work at Bombay absorbed the best years of my life, and I need not explain how much I feel about it. I wish the institute prosperity as an active center of work on behalf of health organizations, and I send blessings to the entire staff. Now, I grew up in Bombay, and unfortunately, I have not been to the Haffkine Institute. But once things settle down over here, one of the things that I want to do is go back to Bombay and, go to the Haffkine Institute, because, I certainly I grew up in Bombay, so I feel I should, So vaccines have made us feel, invisible. So the current pandemic is frustrating, as the small virus is disrupting our way of life. There are several vaccines over here. You have the mRNA-based vaccines, which were the first ones over here that came up, but they are primarily in the West, because they need to be kept in -80. And so that kind of cold chain, that's not there. So it's primarily in the West, and especially led by Moderna and Pfizer. You have the whole inactivated virus, which is the Covaxin, and which is the mainstay vaccine that we use now. You have the viral vector vaccines, and where they put a part of the coronavirus, which is a part of the spike protein in a non-replicating adenovirus, which is what Covishield is, right? And even the Sputnik, the viral, the Russian one, it has the same technology over here. You have other ones also, like the virus-like particle, the Novavax, and so on, and the spike protein along with alum with an adjuvant, which is given by biological E. But by and large, you have the Covishield, which is what I was telling you about. You have the Covaxin, which is the entire inactivated vaccine. You have the mRNA vaccines. You have the Zydus Cadila DNA vaccine, and which has been approved now for those above 12 years of age. There is some efficacy, but you have to give it thrice and so on. And you also have the baculovirus in lipid nanoparticles, and this is the Novavax, which has been biological E is doing this. But one must remember that vaccines will not, do not prevent 100% of infections. Remember, the efficacy ranges from 70 to 90% and so on. So breakthrough infections do occur. But the good thing is disease severity is less and hospitalizations are less. And that is the most important thing that we need to keep in mind. So efficacy of vaccines, Covishield is about 70, Covaxin is about 77, Moderna are much higher, but still breakthrough infections do occur. Right? So how is it that these new vaccines, came up? But before that, let's discuss the percentage vaccine. In the world, 46% of the population is entirely vaccinated. So this, that is why a large majority are unvaccinated, and this is what might give rise to variants. In fact, the new current one, the Omicron one in South Africa, a lot of the HIV patients are unvaccinated, and that is the breeding ground for them. UAE, Israel have very high rates of vaccination. Chile has also a high rate, but it has a lot of infections because Sinovac is not that effective and so on, right? So in India, for example, we have about 35% of our population that's fully vaccinated. Pakistan is a lot less. Bhutan has done one of our neighbors has done a much better job of vaccinating a large population, right? 74% of its population is fully vaccinated. So something to keep in mind. So again, with respect to the mRNA vaccines, which are the mainstay now of the West, right? It's important to keep in mind the contributions of Kathleen Carrico. In fact, do read up upon her write-ups on how she made up and all the struggles that she faced because her thing was RNA, and she could make an RNA for anything. And so she got together with Drew Weissman, and then they started work on trying to make RNA vaccines, right? And when, it worked very well in cell cultures, but the moment you went to mice, the mice responded to it, right? So then what they realized was you had to modify the RNA. You have to modify the RNA such that the pattern recognition molecules in the host would not recognize it. So by modifying, they were able to generate, and this was a very famous paper in immunity in 2015 that they published. And this was followed up by other people to look for mRNA vaccines for other things, right? Either for stem cell biology or for cancers and so on. So that was the idea. And then, of course, the pandemic came up and people started, making the change. Okay, but just RNA alone is insufficient. You have to do it together with other lipid nanoparticles, and this is where the work done by Peter Cullis is very important, because you have the RNA, you have to protect it, and you protect it using a lipid nanoparticle. But this has to be stored in the cold, in -70, and so this is what I was telling you about the cold chain. So these, these are important aspects. And again, please, read a little bit about this. But people don't make vaccines in isolation. You have a lot of government that is involved, and you also have the private partners. So it needs, two to tango, and it needs both academia and government institutions. So, one must keep in mind that both play very important roles over here. So again, this is, studies done with the Punjab police as well as the Tamil Nadu police, because, unfortunately, nurses, healthcare workers, the police are in the front line, right? Or security people are in the front line, and so they need to be protected. And what is interesting is that those that did not get vaccinated, in terms of casualties, you have 3. Right? And if you have 1 dose, it is protective. And if you have 2 doses, it's really protective. So this is very important. And that's why you need to be fully vaccinated. And that's the important part over here. Okay, so the other aspect is about making these vaccines, right, and about the fact that the vaccines are not uniformly distributed, right. You have large parts of the world where you don't have access to vaccines. You have maybe large parts in the country that don't have access, and so therefore we need to think about these aspects and figure out a way where you can quickly generate vaccines and make it accessible to both the rich as well as the poor. So that's something that's very important, and we need to think about these aspects out over here. So let me just come up briefly and tell you about how we did our part of the work. So as I said, I have been teaching immunology. One of the questions that come up is, why is it that some people are sensitive to allergies, right? Why is it that some people are sensitive to some infections, right? Why I mean, we are all exposed to it. We are all exposed to pollen, but some people are sensitive to pollen allergies. We are all exposed to pathogens. I'm sure most of us are positive. We have seen tuberculosis, but we don't come down with TB, right? So also because of teaching, you have to keep track of newer disease spreads, SARS, Ebola, and so on. So in 11th March, WHO declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic. And in 16th March, students in IISc were asked to go home based on the Government of Karnataka advisory. So, and then 25th March, lockdown was announced in India by the government, right? So there was one student who was with me, and no experimental work was allowed, and to take care of the fridges, the refrigerators, and so on. So, and we had to move out of our comfort zone, and so what we could do was only theoretical work. And it was also important for me to keep Sanmoy academically active, right? Otherwise, he'd be doing WhatsApp and Facebook all the time. And this is one of the problems with students these days. They spend more time on WhatsApp and Facebook rather than, or Instagram rather than, the actual reading stuff. But these were the observations at that time, right? Countries such as US, Italy, Spain, France have high number of COVID-19 deaths, whereas other countries like, India, Pakistan, and Myanmar had much lower. So the virus originated from China, but it has low deaths, very few in fact, right? And in terms of spikes, there are hardly any spikes. When the virus came into India, we expected, a lot of deaths in Dharavi, Mumbai, right? The slum part, because there is no way you can do physical distancing over there. But they were a lot less than expected. So what was it that might lead, right? So one, of course, you have these, wearing masks and so on, environmental factors. We are a warm country. The other countries are cold countries, right? Populations, vaccinations, comorbidities. The richer countries also have, a lot of the elderly population, pathogen exposure, cultural aspects, so on, right? Right. So one of the questions is, what are the effect of different pathogens on COVID incidences and deaths? Do different vaccination policies affect COVID-19? Right. So if you see over here, these are the ones where there's virtually no TB. And these are the countries with TB, and you can see India, high TB, right? And Africa and so on. But these are the ones where you had less COVID. These are the ones where you have high COVID, right, at that time. If you look at flu also, and because they both are respiratory infections, right? Again, less flu over here. Less flu, why less flu? Less flu because, a large number of their populations have been asked to take flu vaccines. So their exposure to flu is less because the vaccine protected, right? Whereas we have high flu. Right, we have high flu because I mean, most of us come down with colds and so on, and that might. This was the observation that was there, and that was. So what we did is, we did epidemiological studies, took data from the internet, and this is what we got. So if you look at flu deaths, and what we did is we did it across time points, in a kinetic way, May, October, and 31st, and you can see there's negative correlation. There is negative correlation. So countries with high flu deaths show less COVID-19 deaths and so on, right? Right. So why was this? Is there non-specific immunity? So if you have flu, is increase in non-specific immunity. Flu infections are also thought to downregulate ACE2 expression, so that might also affect. And then we also invoke viral interference. So if you have one virus, it prevents other viruses from replicating. So that was another possibility. So you have TB deaths. Now with TB also we saw the same. More the TB, so it's negatively correlating, right? More the TB deaths in countries, lesser COVID-19 deaths, and so on. So based on this, we categorized, the countries into different groups, which is, TB high, flu low, which had TB deaths, and which countries where you have, low TB and low flu, again they have higher number, and these are all, statistically significant. We went into vaccines and again found with BCG, we found a similar negative trend. So countries with high BCG vaccinations show lower COVID-19 deaths, right? So again, BCG is important because it's known to induce what's known as trained immunity, or it epigenetically reprograms macrophages into leading higher amounts of cytokines and so on, right? So again, this is what we found. Let's take over here. So the least number of COVID-19 deaths were seen in countries with high BCG and no flu vaccination, and India and all come in this category. And this is the one with no BCG vaccination but high flu vaccinations, and which is where US, Italy, Spain, Germany, Belgium come under this category, right? So this is where we sort of categorized them into this case. And if you look at kinetically also, we are the ones, this is the BCG plus, Fluvac minus, where it takes much longer for the COVID-19 cases to occur. So again, something important over here, whereas the BCG negative, Fluvac positive are the ones that see it the fastest. Okay, so that's again something that so the countries were based on BCG and flu deaths, and this was a novel piece over here of evidence over here. So anyway, I will not go over here. You've got, so basically what we have done is BCG coverage shows negative correlation. BCG with flu, but no flu, with BCG but no flu vaccination, most delayed transmission, right, in a kinetic way. BCG vaccination alone is protective, but COVID-19 deaths catch up, right? So therefore, countries with high TB or flu deaths as well as high BCG coverage are the most protected, right? So that's important. So you need a combination of both BCG as well as natural respiratory infections, which are protected. So this is what we were saying is you have BCG vaccination plus continuous exposure to pathogens, and maybe the two together leads to higher cross protection against different diseases and so on. And this is what perhaps has been protecting us against the lower COVID-19 deaths, right? So a combination is really important part over here, right? So the deaths, so all the data over there was till 31st December 2021, right? So the first wave, you had lockdown measures in place, and we took reasonable care. In the second wave, what happened is the virus incubated, adapted to our conditions, right? And it led to variants, the Delta, which led to greater transmission, right? And important for all microbiologists to be more aware, we dropped our guard and allowed the virus to, to create havoc in our countries, right? So most countries, for example, daily deaths, if you see a lot of spikes over here, and that's shows spikes except China, Denmark and so on. If you look at deaths also, there are spikes even now. In fact, US, UK, Europe, you have a lot of deaths occurring compared to us. So clearly multifactorial issues are at place, but our study sort of brought into play the roles of other respiratory diseases and vaccines in modulating this disease. So as I said, it's a combination that, so there might be some advantages in living under not so clean environments. And are there any examples of this? One, of course, is the hygiene hypothesis. And for those of you who are not familiar with the hygiene hypothesis, it's seen that people who live in very clean environments, they are more sensitive to allergies. They're more sensitive to allergies because they have not exposed to different pathogens and so on. So perhaps So perhaps we, because we are exposed to, different types, our natural immunity is higher. We've also been, vaccinated with BCG that leads to epigenetic reprogramming of our monocytes, and that together they may be leading to better cross protection. And, it's likely to be an important lesson for the West in. So, variants are of big concern, as I mentioned. So that's something that must keep in mind. Remember that vaccinated folks can get reinfected, but vaccination protects against severe COVID. So do keep that in mind. Roles of cross-reactive T cells need to be studied more. And again, so we need to protect ourselves. Remember, mask, physical distancing, sanitization need to be performed. Avoid going to crowded areas and so on. Right? Don't travel unless it's a must. Now, we need to keep in mind that doctors, healthcare workers are also suffering from burnout, wellness issues. So it's better if we keep ourselves protected, we don't have to go to the hospitals and all. We are also helping them in that because they are already overloaded, right? So it's a huge stress on our healthcare system, and we need to reprioritize this thing. So most important thing is there are likely to be variants. We should not drop our guard and so on. So anyway, avoid the 3 C's: avoid crowds, close space, and avoid physical contact. Right. Bottom line is we need to live with the virus, and we need to protect ourselves. So that's the most important things, right? So patience, hope, humility is important. Over here, I'd like to thank the people involved. This is Tanmoy, who did most of the work. This is Mohit, whom we collaborated for all the thing. I'd like to thank people. Taru has always been helping us. She's so I was not interested in doing this, but Dipankar Ghosh, DN Rao, Soman Basak all asked me to write a review on COVID, and I was tired of writing a review. I had just written a review on another aspect, so it was good to contribute to something new. I'd like to thank these people for their help, suggestions over here. And of course, we have funding from the DBT IISc program and so on. So you can see COVID has been affecting our lab also. January 2020, we were not aware of all this happening. This is the lab without masks and so on. And July 2021, our numbers have greatly reduced, right? And we are masked and so on. And this was a picture of IISc taken in April 2020 during the lockdown. And I thank you all for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your experience on your work on the work in your laboratory. In-depth talk on COVID-19 and other respiratory infections, the immunological aspects, and the vaccines for COVID, sir. Thank you. Sir, we have a few queries, sir, in the chat box.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
So earlier there was some speculation that the Indian genetic makeup or the BCG vaccination it makes us less susceptible to SARS-CoV-2. But however, it was proved wrong in the second wave. So what do you think went wrong in the speculation?
Yeah. So exactly. So I've discussed this. You had huge transmissibility problems. You had variants over here, especially the Delta variant came over there. So it's a combination of factors. We thought we had triumphed because we had triumphed on the first wave, right? And that's why I had discussed that. And so in the second wave, we were caught off guard. We were doing the melas, the Kumbh Mela and the other melas. We were allowing the virus to spread, higher transmissibility, and you had the variants coming up. It really led to a huge spread. And as the numbers increased, as I keep mentioning, the numbers are very important. If you have, 1,000 is okay, but once it crosses million, again, not everyone, was affected, right? Not everyone needed to be hospitalized. But as the numbers increase, as the number of positive cases increase, even if you have 5%, in the hospitals, that really increases. And so that clearly showed, the thing. So Also, even in that work, we showed just BCG alone isn't good enough, because by that time we had already evidence of that, because the South American countries like Brazil and all, they are BCG positive, right? But they were also not that well protected. What our work showed, that primarily it's a combination of both BCG vaccination as well as other exposures that would play. But of course, there are limits to this. Now, if you leave all guard and just leave everything, it's not going to help you, and which is what happened in the second wave. And that is why we need to be continuously to be careful. We cannot just say, oh, we have a great immunity and then it will protect us against everything, right? So there are limits to all this. But it certainly held very well in the first wave, in the first part in 2020, and that is what the data was all about. So we are planning to do it in what happened in 2021. And again, kinetically, if we see, we will need to see what happens.
So there is one more question.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Sir, what were the difficulties you faced as a researcher? Since the COVID is associated with many government regulations and lockdown restrictions were there.
Yes, so certainly, I mean, for months we were under lockdown, we could not do any work, right? Some of our grants expired. Money was a problem, getting money, because also people in the grant offices, they are also not there, right? So it has certainly affected us greatly. There is absolutely no doubt about it, both in terms of funding and students, their months also have been lost, right? Because they were the first time they were sent home, the second wave they were over here, but they were not allowed to work. So they have also lost months of work. So these are all aspects that are there.
I have a question, Satish.
Sir.
Dr. Dipankar.
Yeah.
Dr. Vinod, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Sure.
It was an excellent presentation and your experience shared.
Sure.
I have a small question. It's just a hypothesis.
Right.
Yeah. It is speculated that the pediatrics, age group, they didn't suffer with the COVID mainly because they're all polio vaccinated.
This is another thing, right?
Yeah,
measles vaccination also helps. Yes.
Yeah, the reason given is the both polio and the coronavirus both are positive virus, and there is a lot of homology between the RDRP of the polio virus and the coronavirus, and it's also speculated that if we vaccinate even the adult, I think the polio vaccine may give protection to COVID. So what is your feedback for that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what these vaccines do is they will induce some level of cross protection. So whether it is measles, whether it is polio, there will be some level of cross protection. So I think that is perhaps what is probably helping. But these would be all non-specific. So if for people working with infectious diseases, they would want a specific vaccine. Only in the absence of a specific vaccine would they be able to justify a non-specific one. So that is why you see, vaccine makers and all will go in for specific vaccines. And certainly, there has been success over here. Tomorrow, another new virus comes up. You can try and protect your population using non-specific means. BCG primarily is a non-specific means of protecting your population. It does not guarantee, right? But certainly for infectious disease biology folks and so on, they would want a specific vaccine. And also for government and for everyone to justify their work, it has to be a specific vaccine, which is why it has moved now in the specific vaccine approach.
Thank you, Sam. Once again, thank you once again for accepting our invitation for this. Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we have the next lecture by Dr. Sneha, HICC practices in COVID hospital. Dr. Sneha is currently working as an assistant professor in Department of Microbiology, Bangalore Medical College. She has around total 13 years of experience for teaching both UGs and PGs. She now is working as a laboratory quality manager and infection control officer at Victoria Hospital, Bangalore. She is also a coordinator for national and state health programs such as vaccine preventable diseases, WHO India, National Viral Disease Control Program, and State AIDS Reference Center for STI and RTI at Bangalore Medical College. She is also a certified NABH assessor for entry-level assessment and internal auditor for National Quality Assessment Scheme and NABL. She is a principal investigator or co-investigator for around 8 projects in collaboration with the Indian Institute of Science, AIIMS, and Center for Human Genetics, Bangalore, and also with RGHS. She has many publications, and she has delivered many guest lectures and also conducted many workshops and conferences. And she is also a reviewer in many national and international journals. Over to you, Dr. Sneha.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Just give me a few minutes. I am about to share my slides. Just give me 2 minutes.
Okay, madam.
Share
Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, madam. We can see, madam.
Okay.
We need to do the slideshow, madam.
Yes, yes.
Yes, madam. Okay.
Is it visible?
Yes, madam. It is. No.
Okay, so first of all, I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my experience in infection prevention and control, especially during COVID-19. And I also congratulate them for having successfully organized this scientific session. So I request all the participants. You can see there is a trash bin here, and just a few meters away, we can see the trash being thrown on the road, right? So there is meters between knowledge and practice, meters between benevolence and neglect, meters between progress and backwardness, and meters that determine a culture. I request you all to think about it. So today I'll be talking to you about infection prevention and control in healthcare facility during COVID times. Myself, along with Dr. Shweta, we are working as infection control officers at Victoria Hospital attached to Bangalore Medical College in Bangalore. Now, we microbiologists play dual roles, that is examining germs under the microscope, as well as looking for them flourishing elsewhere in the hospital. And I'm sure you all agree that the second part is tougher than the first. So infection prevention and control, is not a destination, it's a process, and the secret is in getting started. And it's the responsibility and accountability of each and every healthcare worker, right from consultants to housekeeping, to get involved in this process. So I would like to share my views under these headings: infection prevention and control, why, who is supposed to do it, how are we supposed to do it, and having known why, who, and how, what are we supposed to do, when are we supposed to do, and where. So if we answer all these questions, I think we will get a gist of what actually is infection prevention and control. And it's equally important, or rather more important, during the present times. So coming to the first question, why? Infection prevention and control is essential to prevent the transmission of infection to the patients or also the healthcare workers within the hospital or the healthcare facility. So the measures which are taken to prevent or reduce such events help in patient safety as well as healthcare worker safety. And this can be brought in by providing quality healthcare services. And the major waves of COVID-19 pandemic that we have faced and are still enduring has posed unprecedented challenge to the entire healthcare system like never before. I'm sure you all agree. And this COVID-19, which is transmitted through droplets whenever the infected person coughs, sneezes, or exhales, and either by breathing in the virus, by being in close proximity to someone who has COVID, or by touching contaminated surface with bare hands and then touching our eyes, nose, and mouth, can lead to infection. So when people get infected, majority recover without hospitalization with just mild to moderate symptoms. However, few can go into severity and need hospitalization. And it is such hospitalized patients who are also prone to develop hospital-acquired infection during their stay in the hospital, and hence standard infection control practices have become more imperative than ever. So having known why, let us see who has to do this. So as I've said already, it is responsibility of each and every one of us working in the hospital. However, the survey has shown us that the serious challenges that are faced in the hospital towards IPC are: one, lack of leadership; second is active resistance to infection control within the organization; and third is lack of resources. So the key is to engage leadership, be it the head of the institute, head of the department, unit heads, professors, who can lead by example. And the second key is education or training. The teaching staff can train the PGs to interns, interns to nursing staff, so on and so forth. Now in our hospital, which is a large tertiary care hospital with a bed strength of around 1,000, with close to 1,000 outpatient inputs per day, around 100 inpatients being admitted every day, around close to 500 surgeries per month, and a big force of healthcare workers, we came up with Hospital Infection Control Committee way back in 2016, and it is renewed at regular intervals. The recent renewal, as you can see, took place in March this year. And this is headed by the medical superintendent, and HOD microbiology is the member secretary. And as you can see, the representatives from various clinical and paraclinical departments, and also different departments in the hospital, such as the biomedical engineer, the electrical engineer, the dietitian, the housekeeping, the nursing faculty, are all members of the HICC committee. But the backbone of this is the infection control team. And with both of us, myself and Shweta, we have a very efficient and enthusiastic team of infection control nurses who are actually running the show. So now how do we go about infection prevention and control? So the most important thing is to put the things in black and white on paper. So HIC manual is the important guidelines which steers the whole program. So though we had the infection control manual in place since the inception of the committee, we came up with separate guidelines for infection prevention and control during the pandemic of COVID-19, and we released it on 26th March 2020. It was made as a separate guideline because this infection was new to us. But later, when it was time for the infection control manual to be renewed, we knew that this COVID is going to stay with us for a while. And then during the revision, we incorporated these guidelines into the hospital control, infection control manual itself. So we have clearly defined the roles and responsibilities right from the administrators to the HICC members. And in fact, each and every part of the infection control committee who knows to do what and how. So we conduct the HICC meetings monthly. Earlier, it used to be a physical meeting, as you can see. But during the pandemic, we had to go on a virtual mode, and some of the meetings were also conducted through virtual platforms. The agenda for the meeting is circulated in advance, and once the meeting is successfully conducted, the proceedings or the minutes are recorded and circulated among all the members. And as we can see, training is an important aspect of the infection control meeting and the steps to be taken in most of these HICC meetings. Now, having known why, how, and how, we should know what, when, and where. So these are some of the important steps or things to be taken up by Infection Control Committee to formulate the guidelines, to have standard precautions being executed, guidelines for disinfection and sterilization, for maintenance of environmental cleanliness, guidelines for biomedical waste management, maintenance of laundry and linen, guidelines for CSST, and equally important is the safety of the healthcare worker. So staff health program, vaccination guidelines also need to be put in place. So as I said, training and retraining is important. So we come up with the training calendar, which are displayed in most of the notice boards so that staff are aware as to what training is going to take place. And then we had physical trainings as well as virtual trainings separately for each cadre. Like I can show you in these photographs here for the nursing officers, for the laboratory technicians, for the group D and housekeeping, depending on what they're supposed to learn or what they're supposed to be trained on, the topics can be different. The agenda for the training can be different. And I am sure you all agree, this is the toughest part, training of the doctors. And in spite of training, retraining, the compliance usually is less, especially when it comes to hand hygiene and other parameters in comparison to nursing faculty. So because of this COVID-19, we had to incorporate certain guidelines, which we call as general guidelines. And it was for all healthcare workers, regardless of the specific exposure risk. So we re-emphasize the importance of hand wash with soap and water or alcohol-based hand rub, importance of social distancing from others, that is patients, including your co-workers, because we all know there can be asymptomatic transmission, avoiding touching of eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands. And very important was to emphasize to the healthcare workers that PPEs are not an alternative to basic preventive measures. And these basic preventive measures such as social distancing, hand washing have to be followed all the times. Also, coughing and sneezing in the bent elbow, avoiding crowding in the hospital premises, using elbow instead of hands for opening doors, operating switches, etc., minimizing the use of cell phones and cleaning them in between. These are all very simple but effective steps in preventing COVID-19. Now, moving on to standard precautions. So, as microbiologists, we have not only heard, but we have taught many as to what are these standard precautions. So, right from hand hygiene to PPE, to instrument processing and cleaning, to environmental control, and last but the most important, biomedical waste management is what constitutes the standard precautions. So, the 7 steps of hand hygiene, this is something like a Bible for us. We all know, we have taught, we have practiced, and one should be able to do even with the closed eyes and teach others the importance of 7 steps of hand hygiene as per the WHO guidelines. Using the running tap water and liquid soap is very, very important. And not only knowing how to do, but when to do is more important. That is the 5 moments of hand hygiene, which are very important in protecting the healthcare worker and equally the patients are these 5 moments of hand hygiene. Nevertheless, it is equally important, like once you train and they have learned, You want to see how much they have learned, how much they are adhering to what you have taught them. So we started with compliance monitoring for hand hygiene using WHO checklist earlier. But of late, we have enrolled ourselves for the JIPMER-led hand hygiene project, in which we are monitoring the hand hygiene using an app called as iBhar app. And it has been a blessing, especially during these COVID times, because it prevents the use of pen and paper, and it helps us to capture the moments of hand hygiene using this iBhar app. And I'm sorry to say that again, we have seen that the hand hygiene compliance of the doctors is more or less compared to that of the nursing faculty and other faculty. But the silver lining is, due to COVID-19, this compliance has improved marginally, and it has increased in comparison to pre-COVID times in our hospital. And I'm glad to share that we have come a long way from a simple tap and a bar soap to a liquid soap and elbow taps. This is an achievement actually. And 7 steps of hand hygiene are displayed in most of the areas across the hospital. Now coming to the next component, that is PPE, the donning and the doffing sequence. We have trained and also displayed the sequence of removing and putting on the PPE, and also demonstrated them to the different healthcare workers, especially the wearing of the gloves and masks is very important. And the training should be in such a way, and it should be so effective, not only they are comfortable, but it's also gives them confidence to work with that PPE in a COVID environment where there is already a lot of stress. So majority of the healthcare workers were trained and they knew how to use the PPE. Now moving on to environmental disinfection, as I've already told, transfer of microorganisms from the surfaces is mostly via hand contact. So after touching the infected surfaces, be door handles, handrails, elevator buttons, one should avoid touching face, eyes, nose, etc. And the cleaning and disinfection is very important. That of the environmental surface is very important and fundamental in addition to hand hygiene. So coming to environmental disinfection, which is performed by the housekeeping staff, we should train them to wear appropriate PPE and also provide them with appropriate PPE. It's very important. And equally important is to train them as to how to discard and perform the hand hygiene once it is used. And for the environmental disinfection, the common used disinfectants such as the 1% sodium hypochlorite, which needs to be prepared freshly every day, use of dilute household bleach if there is no supply of sodium hypochlorite should be taught to the housekeeping faculty. And one should also teach don'ts in addition to do's. One should never mix household bleach with ammonia or any other cleanser for the side effects which are known and can be hazardous. And equally important is to know that one should use either 70% ethyl alcohol or isopropyl alcohol when the bleach is not advised. For example, metallic surfaces wherein it can lead to corroding. Now, another important and strange thing we all witnessed during this pandemic was spraying of 1% sodium hypochlorite. Now, the literature and the scientific evidence clearly says that spraying is not only unscientific, but also can be hazardous because it can create aerosols, which can in fact lead to more spread of viruses such as COVID-19. So we should strongly discourage the use of spray, and one should use these disinfectants and clean the surfaces using the wet mop because that ensures the contact and effective environmental disinfection. Now, the other parts of the hospital, such as the floor, the walls, etc., need to be cleaned with detergent and copious amount of water. Dusting needs to be done with a wet mop. So also the other fixtures in the patient rooms, and all these work surfaces after the washing need to be disinfected using appropriate disinfectant. Similarly, the patient belongings and the cupboards, shelves, beds, lockers, IV stands need to be cleaned with detergent, and if at all you find any evidence of the things being soiled with blood and body fluids, we should advocate the housekeeping staff to use 1% sodium hypochlorite. The toilets and the wash basins need to be cleaned with appropriate detergent and disinfectants, according to the schedule shared by the hospital. So when it comes to mopping, there are certain simple and very important points. So the housekeeping staff needs to be trained to progress from the least soiled area to the most soiled area, from the high surface to the low surface, to remove the gross soil prior to cleaning, not to shake mops, because we have to minimize the turbulence as they make the dust that may contain the microorganisms, and never to use brooms. We should advocate using wet mop or the damp mop and clean them under running water and not to double dip. So these points are very simple but very effective in infection prevention and control. And equally important is to put a schedule. You should not only tell them how to clean, but when. So for frequent touch surfaces and horizontal surfaces, 4th-hourly cleaning is advocated. For other surfaces and floor, bathrooms, as well as toilets, twice to once a daily is advocated. Twice a daily is better during COVID times. Otherwise, once a daily, as per the hospital protocol, is advocated. Now, in our hospital, we have the protocols displayed and put up in majority of the areas for equipments, for general environment, and for patient care equipment. And to ensure that the housekeeping staff does and stick to the schedule and does the cleaning appropriately, we have put up checklists across various hospital areas, and these are ticked and countersigned by appropriate or the nursing faculty in charge of those wards on a daily basis to ensure the compliance. Similarly, for bedside cleaning, for ward cleaning, for frequent touch surface cleaning, checklists have displayed and it is monitored efficiently by our in charge nursing officers. Even toilet check cleaning is in place. And at hospital, ever since the inception of the Kayakalpa program, we have insisted on using 3-bucket system wherein it prevents the transmission of germs. So there are 3 buckets. One contains the detergent and the other one the fresh water, and then the dry one, wherein they need not come, they can use it in only one directional so that the infection can be minimized. And majority of the areas, they are using this 3-bucket system. And the cleanliness of the entire hospital, including the high surfaces, are effectively monitored by our infection control nursing officers. Now, coming to the COVID areas where the patients are admitted, there are certain protocols to be put in place. So these patients need to have isolation rooms or need to be cohorted in a separate ward. We have all undergone this exercise and we all know all these things in detail. So minimum of distance of 1 meter between the beds, posting of signages, removing the non-essential furnitures, and separate entry and exit if it can be arranged. It is an ideal practice. And stocking of enough PPE and biomedical waste management bins is very, very important. Patients should be advised to keep the belongings to a minimum, and if possible, dedicated non-critical patient care equipment should be there, like stethoscope, thermometer, blood pressure cuffs, etc. should be dedicated to each patient to prevent the cross transmission. Adequate room ventilation should be advised, and if possible, negative pressure should be created either through putting up an exhaust fan or by ideal means. And visitors should be strictly disallowed, and telephone or any other method of communication should be used for communicating from the COVID area to the other areas. Now, coming to the last but the most important point of standard precautions, that is biomedical waste management. So there was a guideline which everybody followed, that any new screening area, isolation ward, hospital or laboratory which handle COVID-19 samples or patients, opening of such establishments or healthcare facilities had to be reported to State Pollution Control Board. And the guidelines therein were applicable to all areas where there were patients with COVID-19, whether it is screening area, OPD, isolation ward, transportation like ambulances, or the laboratories where the patient samples were collected and processed. These guidelines are applicable to each and every part of these hospitals. And these guidelines, which we all have efficiently followed, clearly mention that the COVID waste needs to be segregated as per the biomedical waste guidelines of 2016, which were amended in 2018. And the COVID waste goes into double layered bags. All these waste should be labeled as COVID-19 waste. They should be stored, transported, and handed over separately. We have to maintain a separate record or register, transport them in dedicated trolleys, bins, or containers. And these containers or trolleys had to be washed with 1% sodium hypochlorite after the use. And general waste should be handled separately, including the workers who need to be dedicated and separate for biomedical waste and general waste. So these were the guidelines with respect to biomedical waste management. So Act placed the SOPs and also trained the nursing faculty to monitor and the housekeeping faculty who actually are involved in handling the biomedical waste. And we came up with a MOU separately for COVID waste and non-COVID waste as per the Government of Karnataka guidelines. And each and every healthcare worker was trained as to what to dispose where: infected plastic into red, infected non-plastic into yellow, use of foot operated bins, and all other important components were trained and retrained so that they or the needle cans to minimize the needle stick injuries. Needle stick injuries happen during stress, and COVID-19 was no less than a stress. So it was very important to emphasize on these aspects as well. And we are using the non-chlorinated bags as per environmental pollution guidelines, since the guidelines are in place. And the posters for the segregation are displayed in various areas of the hospital. As you can see here, the foot operated bins are kept in majority or all of the wards and other hospital areas. There is a dedicated trolley for transportation, wherein the 3 compartments are segregated, and the red and yellow have biohazard symbol as well. And it is transported a dedicated trolley to the biomedical waste management plant, which is at the far end of the hospital premises, and it is separate, having separate rooms, and it is well lit and well ventilated. And as you can see, there are separate rooms for storage of different color coded waste bags, and each type of waste is weighed daily and recorded. And also we have a separate entry for COVID waste and non-COVID waste. Our hospital initially had turned into COVID only. In between, we were handling COVID patients, and now it's again become a non-COVID establishment. And though we were, as you can see here, though we were recording the details of the biomedical waste in a physical register, as per the mandate of the Karnataka State Pollution Control Board, the COVID waste every day was entered into a mobile app as prescribed by them. And as you can see, the weight every day is displayed here along with the different color codings of our hospital. And again, as per the guidelines, we pre-treat the biomedical waste before handling it over to the common waste treatment operator. So we have a dedicated discard autoclave, which is operated by a dedicated staff who is given provided with all appropriate PPE and is also trained. And the quality of the autoclave is monitored using chemical indicators daily and biological indicators once in a month to ensure that it is effectively working. The liquid waste also is handled as per the guidelines. We have dosimeters at blood bank, at operation theatre and the laboratory where we are likely to encounter the liquid waste. And these dosimeters, they pump the sodium hypochlorite at appropriate intervals. And after the contact time of 30 minutes, they let them into the effluent treatment plant. So the effluent treatment plant is one of the biggest in our state. So you can see it's a very big effluent treatment plant catering to such a big hospital, and it is taken care very properly. And we also have the reports of the water being tested of this effluent treatment plant before it is let off into the drain. And as per the mandate, the reports of the biomedical waste is prepared annually and submitted with the due signatures from the administrators. Now coming to the linen management, laundry plays a very important role in linen management. And as per the guidelines, COVID linen needs to be treated as soil linen and collected as per the hospital's HICC policy. But the nursing faculty needs to be trained in handling linen. They should be told to take care while removing the bed sheets, not to strip off and shake them to prevent the generation of the aerosols, transport them in dedicated trolleys to the dispatch area, and the workers in the laundry need to be provided with protective gear for handling the linen. So here in the photographs, you can see this is a new laundry which has been in our hospital premises, and a healthcare worker is wearing appropriate PPE, and this is the trolley which is used for transportation of the linen. Now, laundry has a separate area for receiving and handling the linen, and there are hand washing facilities also. And we use machine washing, wherein warm water of about 60 to 90 degrees with the laundry detergent is being used. However, if the hospital does not have automated laundry, the COVID linen can be washed manually, but they have to be soaked in hot water and soap, and also 0.05% chlorine for about 30 minutes, following which they can be rinsed with clean water and allowed to dry fully in sunlight. So either ways, the linen can be handled. And as per our hospital policy, we segregate them into these color codes as dirty, soiled and infected linen, and handle them as per the guidelines. So this is the linen room wherein they are segregated and supplied as per the indent from different wards. And recently we have come up with the color coding for different wards because there was a lot of mix up. So you can see for medicine wards or for surgical wards and others, there is a separate color coding. And another important area which falls under the infection prevention and control is Central Sterile Supply Department, or CSST, which is looked after by our department, Department of Microbiology in Victoria premises. And we have a very good state-of-the-art Central Sterile Supply Department. And as you can clearly see in this photograph, it has been clearly demarcated into dirty zone with the color flooring and the staff wearing similar color uniform, clean zone with the blue uniform and blue flooring, and this is a sterile zone. So the staff are posted for each zone separately, and at no point in time there is a crossover of these faculty working in CSST. It has a separate receiving counter and issue counter, and all the faculty work as per the SOPs mentioned in the CSST manual here, and the transportation of the linen is done in closed trolleys. And we can clearly see the state-of-the-art facility has equipment such as ultrasonic washer and washer disinfector here. And you can clearly see the pass box. This is the red zone. So from red to blue zone, it is passed through the pass box. And similarly from blue zone to the sterile zone also, this is a sterile zone. They are all transported using the pass box and not by bare hands. And again, I'm glad to say that we have come a long way in CSST practices. This is our old CSST wherein we had these bins with multiple bandages, as you can see here, being autoclaved. But now we have shifted on to practice with the sterile dressings being singly packed and supplied to the various clinical departments as per the indent. And we ensure the quality by running the Bovidic test the first cycle in the morning by sticking to class 4 indicators and class 6 indicators, chemical indicators, and also the biological indicators, which are run at frequent intervals, and we ensure that they pass the test. Now, this was about the patient case safety. Now, equally important is to take care of ourselves, that is healthcare worker safety. So during the pandemic, it was all the more essential to train or support them psychologically, as it was a stressful situation, and the same has been addressed effectively by our administrators. And the other aspects, that is the physical aspect, have also been taken care effectively. So we have blood and body fluid and the mercury spillage kits to safeguard our healthcare workers in case of any eventuality. The spill management kit is not only put up across various hospital areas, but the faculty and all the healthcare workers are trained at each, at regular intervals in handling such incidents. And we have a register wherein we track the needle stick injuries and blood and body fluid exposures at Victoria Hospital. and they know the do's and don'ts, such as not to panic, not to squeeze, to run, to wash the hands under running soap, running water and soap whenever they have a needle stick injury, and to contact the infection control team in any such instance. And we have provided with the HIV PEP kit at matron's office, which is 24/7, and the protocols regarding the do's and don'ts have been displayed at different areas in the hospital. Then comes a vaccination. Before COVID, we had faculty vaccination, that is hepatitis B vaccination for all the healthcare workers. Typhoid vaccination for the kitchen workers was provided. And ever since we faced this pandemic, even COVID-19 vaccine register is maintained for the healthcare workers separately. And we have had the fortune of vaccinating some of the dignitaries of the state, as you can see in the photographs here. And so far, we have successfully vaccinated not only around 80% of the healthcare workers, but also the general public. And the staff health is also addressed in the form of annual health checkup for various staff, as you can see, the paramedical, the nursing, the housekeeping, and the doctors. And the process of healthcare workers is updated to all the cadres by way of circulation of these circulars from the administrators. And all the infection control protocols, be it prevention of phlebitis, prevention of COTI, or any other healthcare associated infection are displayed. So also the protocols for needle stick injury and BBF in most of the nursing stations and even other areas where it is clearly visible, and training is conducted regularly to monitor the same. And rates of various HAIs is presented to the HICC members during the monthly meetings of Hospital Infection Control Committee. During the pandemic, we faced another mini pandemic. I'm sure you all agree, that was COVID-associated mucormycosis. And as a Hospital Infection Control Committee, we were actively involved in preparing the guidelines and also for effective management, diagnosis as well. And we had the opportunity to take part in PGI-led study for surveillance of mucormycosis, and our infection control nurses were very active, and they helped in conducting the surveillance for mucormycosis as well. And the Infection Control Committee is very active in addressing the AMR, which is probably going to be the next pandemic, which is very difficult to handle. I'm sure you all agree. So we have antibiotic policy in place, which is revised at regular intervals. The current revision is happening, and we have already circulated the older policy along with the letter from the administrators to the various heads of the clinical department for their inputs, and they are in the process of providing the inputs for revision of antibiotic policy. And as I said, there is a register for tracking hospital-associated infection like COTI, CLABSI, VAP, phlebitis, etc. And both in COVID and non-COVID areas, we would monitor these. But now that our hospital has become a non-COVID hospital again, we are tracking HIs among these patients. And as I said earlier, the data for each month is effectively documented. And in case of increase in SSIs, proper RCA and CAPA, that is root cause analysis, corrective and preventive actions are taken, and they are presented to the HICC committee every month. And to effectively support all these endeavors of the hospital infection control, we have a very able laboratory service, which is a 24/7 laboratory in place, pathology, microbiology, and blood biochemistry, and also the blood bank. And I'm very happy to share that our pathology department is ISO certified, and our own department, Department of Microbiology, is NABL accredited. And very happy to share that our state level BRDL was one of the forefront labs, one of the first labs to start testing in Karnataka. And very proud to say that we have tested more than 12 lakh samples for COVID-19 till date. And we had a tough time handling the lab, the COVID testing, and the infection control. But under the able leadership of our HOD and support from the senior faculty and colleagues, I'm happy to share that we could do the job well. And also happy to share that most of the faculty of our hospital were actively involved in creating the guidelines and also communicating regarding the myths and truths regarding COVID-19. So HOD Medicine, HOD Microbiology, Dr. Ambika, and the administrators from various departments have contributed a lot to the guidelines and during this pandemic. And most important is it's not just the administrators or the clinical staff who are involved, and our own healthcare worker who is involved in handling the waste, biomedical waste. He was also interviewed and he was appreciated for his work, and it came in one of the newspapers. So even the housekeeping, the Group D work has worked efficiently to put infection prevention and control practices in place at our hospital. So we started somewhere here and we reached somewhere here, and probably we are somewhere here is what I can say. So it is a process which needs to be, the path needs to be treaded, and improvements to be done, milestones to be achieved. And I'm happy to say that we are doing bit by bit progress every day. So our way forward is to maintain and improve infection control practices and other parameters at Victoria here. And I thank my team and also my department colleagues for having a good team in place for executing the infection prevention and control activities. And also thank the organizers again for giving me this opportunity to present our experience in this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for sharing your experience at the Bangalore Medical College. You have led us through a simple and easy to follow practical steps to follow in our day-to-day work routine. So BMC, by being the premier institute, has led us by example during the COVID pandemic. So we have a few queries.
Yeah, I think I can ask the first, right? I think I will take that this one. I think I have got 3 questions, Dr. Sneha, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to this national webinar. It was an exhaustive and a very well-made preparation of the HICC practices in your hospital.
Thank you.
The first question, number 1. What was that very, very important, challenging task which was there in you while implementing HICC practices during that COVID pandemic? Your personal experience of implementation of HICC practices in your hospital.
Okay, that was biomedical waste management, I would say. So the most important challenge was to, make the healthcare workers realize the discard of the PPE kit into appropriate bin. Wearing PPE kit for straight 8 hours, they were so exhausted and so tired that they would just throw it here and there and go. So we had a tough time training them and emphasizing the importance of segregating and discarding the PPE kits into appropriate container. That was the most challenging task. So you are on mute.
How many infection control nurses are there in your hospital, madam?
When we started, we had 4. Now we have 7. Ever since COVID pandemic struck, it was 5, 6, and now 7.
Exclusive infection control nurse. I think they will be doing only that exclusive ICN duties only.
Yes, they will be doing, but on rotation, one of them will be was taken up for COVID duty as well.
Any separate budget has been allocated to the HICC, madam, in your institution?
Being a government hospital, most of our requests are met with, but as such, there is no defined budget for infection control.
Thank you so much, madam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam, there's one more question. How has the COVID-19 affected the hospital?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat? I can't hear you. Is this the question, Dr. Satish? How was COVID-19 affected HI and AMR rates in your institution?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam. That is the question. Yes, yes.
Okay, so actually one of our postgraduate students presented the data of AMR in one of the state CMEs recently, and we noticed that definitely there is increase in the AMR, marginal increase in AMR definitely was seen. And as far as HIs, actually our OT was not functional during the COVID times, and we only started our OT, and we are noticing increase in surgical site infections, and we are in the we are addressing the same right now. So definitely AMR and MDR cases have increased.
There were rumors like how to wear mask, how to reuse N95 mask, or using the insecticide spray, or even regarding a quarantine period. There were many like myths in the social media. So what was your approach towards such rumors or myths?
Okay, so actually we had put up the guidelines, or what we can say is the do's and don'ts in the BMCRI website. That was the first thing to do. And initially when the guidelines came, there was no mandate of mask use. So same thing was put up in the website, that the mask use was not compulsory and only symptomatic people were supposed to use the mask way back when the pandemic initiated. But later on it was changed to usage of mask by everybody. Accordingly, we changed that also in the website. So using BMCRI website, we have tried to put a stop to the rumors. And as I've said, we have trained our healthcare workers, and our IC infection control nurses were also very active in training the visitors who come to the hospital regarding the infection control practices which were appropriate for them. And as far as the N95 reuse policy is concerned, we don't have any reuse policy as such in our hospital. We don't advocate the reuse. Fortunately, we have had a good supply of N95 masks. So we never faced any shortage as such. So there was no reuse policy.
Thank you, madam. Thank you. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
As you said, HIC practices, just it is knowing is not enough. It is how much we practice or how much we are committed that makes the difference.
Yes.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Now we come to the end of the session. I request everybody to fill the form. Okay. Myself, Dr. Satish, take this opportunity to present vote of thanks for this remarkable program. Honorable Principal Sir, all the eminent speakers of today's webinar, and all the panelists, delegates, and my colleagues. First, I thank our patrons, Shri Dr. Shamnur Shoshankarappa and Shri S.S. Mallikarjun Sir for their everlasting extensive support. I thank Dr. B.S. Prasad Sir, our principal, who has always been a source of inspiration for all of us and a backbone of any academic activities conducted in the institute. I thank all our speakers of today's webinar. In between, or the ongoing Omicron fiasco is going on, and all our distinguished speakers are on their toes in their efforts to understand it more and lending their hand to the government in effectively containing it. So in spite of their busy schedule, they have agreed to our requests and spare their valuable time with us and made the topics more crisp and cleared our doubts and made the whole program an enriching and learning experience. I thank Dr. V.L. Jayasimha, Professor and Head, Department of Microbiology, who is the reason for the CME to happen. He has always been ahead of times, and he always had in this project in his mind to organize such a CME which is helpful for all of us. Thank you, sir. I thank my colleagues, Dr. Vinod Kumar, Dr. Raghu Kumar, Dr. Yogesh Babu, Dr. Veena, Dr. Shweta and Dr. Veni for extending their full support to conduct the program. I would fail in my job to do if I do not thank enough our non-teaching staff on this occasion, especially Mr. Manjunath, Mr. Roshan, EDP department, and all the non-teaching staff. Finally, I thank our college management for extending full support to the program. Thank you, everyone. In the end, I request all of you to fill the Google form given in the chat box for the certificates. I'll be sharing the link again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Satish Patel, Dr. Shweta, for being the anchors for this esteemed national webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you all the participants. And I think you made my session. Almost 80 plus participants were there for this CME. I think it's one of the success for our CME also. Thank you so much. Good evening to all. Namaskar.